Nightboat. We'll be sharing order links in the chat. I also hope you peruse our title, sign up for our email list, and consider becoming a Nightboat Books subscriber. Now I'll turn it over to Lainey Brown, who is a poet, prose writer, teacher, and editor. She is the author of more than a dozen collections of poems and 4 books of fiction. Recent books include In Garments Worn by Lindens, a book of poetry, the novel Periodic Companions, the book of short fiction, The Book of Moments, and an essay which is related to this project, which I hope you'll check out, called The Poet's Novel as a Form of Defiance, Indeterminate Frame. Translating the Lilies back into lists is forthcoming next year from Wave. She teaches at the University of Pennsylvania and at Swarthmore College. Lainey Brown.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm so happy to welcome you all to this launch event hosted by the wonderful Nightboat. I am speaking to you tonight on Indigenous territory known as Lenape-Hoking, the traditional homelands of the Lenape, also called Lenni Lenape or Delaware Indians. Their descendants today include the Delaware tribe and Delaware Nation of Oklahoma, the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape, Ramapo Lenape, and Powhatan Lenape of New Jersey, and the Munsee Delaware of Ontario. A land acknowledgement is not sufficient, and I want to honor the original caretakers of this land and recognize the histories of land theft, violence, erasure, and oppression. And just add these words from Chelsea Val Metis from Beyond Territorial Acknowledgements. If we think of territorial acknowledgements as sites of potential disruption, they can be transformative acts that to some extent undo Indigenous erasure. I believe this is true as long as these acknowledgements discomfort both those speaking and hearing the words. The fact of Indigenous presence should force non-Indigenous peoples to confront their own place on these lands. I wanted to say thank you to everyone at Nightboat, and Stephen already did, but thank you to everybody. It's been a long labor of love, and especially to Stephen and Lindsay and Kaylin and Kit, who worked with me for years on this project. Also, all of the tremendously talented contributors to the book. We have only a handful here tonight, but thank you. And to everybody who wrote, all the poets who wrote the novels that are written on. So the poets speaking on the novels, writing on the novels, and the poets who wrote the novels, and some of you are doing both. Thank you so much. So this book began with my obsession with books that don't fit into a category and a series of questions about whether or not the poet's novel exists as a form. And what I most wanted to create was a commons for beginning to converse with all the marvelous minds gathered here and in this volume across text, locations, and time. The format of the event will be as follows. Our readers will read in alphabetical order, and I will present short, very short, one-sentence bios for each of them, but I strongly encourage you to please check out the work of all of these fantastic writers. And I'm going to read just one short paragraph from the introduction, and then jump into the bios, and then we will begin with our first contributor. I also wanted to hold this up one more time and say thank you to the artist Noah Satterstrom for his beautiful artwork that's on the cover of the book. The poet's novel, A Form of Refusal. Molière famously writes, "Everything that is not prose is verse, and everything that is not verse is prose." His wit points to the absurdity of drawing absolute lines between genres. I approach this anthology with a similar intent and ultimate refusal to separate texts into categories. Is there such a thing as a poet's novel? Lynn Hygenian writes in Aksoda, a short Russian novel, "So I must oppose the opposition of poetry to prose. What I propose with this collection is to bring focus to many works which resist label or category, and to draw attention to a form about which little has been articulated. Some of these works have been overlooked because they are hybrid, cross-genre texts, or simply because they are uniquely and utterly without precedent. All right, so on to the bios. Tracy Brimhall is the author of 4 books of poetry and lives in Manhattan, Kansas, the Little Apple. Leanne Brown is a poet, singer, filmer, editor, curator, mother, daughter, partner, teacher, and general polyversalist. We have a special surprise guest tonight. Carla Harriman will be performing with Leanne Brown. And Carla Harriman's short bio is, she is a poet, prose writer, essayist, performer, writer whose books include Adorno's Noise, Sue in Berlin, and forthcoming A Voice to Perform, which features an adaptation for opera of her poet's novel, Gardener of Stars. Norman Fisher is a poet, essayist, Zen Buddhist priest, author of The Museum of Capitalism and Selected Poems, 1980 to 2013. Sonnet Labbe writes verse for Song and Page. Their books of poems are A Strange Relief, Killarnoe, Anima Canadensis, and Sonnets Shakespeare. Cedar Saigo's new books include Guard the Mysteries, Lectures, and All This Time, Poetry, both published by Wave. Brian Tier is the author of 6 critically acclaimed books, most recently Doomstead Days, winner of the 4 Quartets Prize, and he lives in Charlottesville, where he teaches at UVA and makes books by hand for his micropress Albion Books. Tyrone Williams teaches in the English and Gender Studies diversity departments, as well as in the Philosophy, Politics, and Public Honors program at Xavier University. So here we go. Thank you all.
So I am kicking things off by virtue of my last name. And what my essay for the collection was about the poet, playwright, and novelist Hilda Hilst. Rather than read from the essay itself, which you should check out when you get the copy of the anthology, and also if you're interested in the poems I read tonight, Nightboat also carries the novels by Hilst, translated novels. But I've translated Hilst's poems because that's how I first learned about Hilst. She's really well known in Brazil, but not very well known or widely read in the United States. And I think it's because she has such a perverse spiritual erotics. And that's perhaps why she might not fit in the puritanical country that we're in. But she's often salacious and mystical, fearless and embodied. And these poems are more than 40 years old. And so I think that's just important context to know for hearing just how bold and fearless and present they feel. There are also my translations from the Portuguese. I won't try and read the Portuguese for you. My mom is from Brazil, but only taught me I love you and shut up growing up. So I won't try and pronounce the Portuguese. So this is poem 7, and it's from this, oh no, it's gonna blur it out. That's terrible. I'm sorry that my background is doing this, but it's this beautiful book. Oh, thank you. Lena's put the link to Hilst's work in the chat. 7. It is hard and kills with its body stake. Love crucifies. Text is blood and mead. It is silky and has claws and licks your efforts. Choose your enjoyment. If you have thirst, it is gall. It has triple canines. It bites the face and a boy cries in his agony. It is father, son, and bird. Love, it may be fine as an English gentleman. It is genuine, pious. Almost always a killer. It is God. 8. It is in this world that I want to feel you. It is the only one I know. What remains of me? Saying I'll meet you in the depths without the blessing of flesh, not after, seems to me a lean promise. Feel the soul? Yes, they can be audacious. But you know the meaty delights of the positions you invented, of the touches, of the beautiful stems, of the corollas. See how small I am and how uninventive. Stem, corolla, those are rosy words, but they bleed if they are made of meat. You will say that human desire cannot see you through famines. Yes, my Lord, you understand. But let me love you in this text with all the raptures of the woman who only knows the man. 13. I take shortcuts, sensing you're up ahead. I return because I think you're back. Some tell me you came close to someone who shouted, "Feel me, Lord. You are so close." And I only now realize you're a hollow bush stuffed with snakes. Someone tells me that someone who screams looks like me, but more of a girl, you know, somewhat older in a way, like someone returning from gorillas. Woman of the woods, daughter of ideas. No, it was you, bitch. For the Lord I said, dust, I am in you. I am all this, hollow bush, and the serpent verses of your mouth. So I'll stop at just 3, but with that introduction and when reading her novel, The Obscene Madam D, and trying to write back to such a book, to such a voice, I chose the epistle because I once heard that when you are in love with somebody, you start to take up their language. So if you're with somebody, maybe you start using the same pet name for each other, or some of the same verbal habits, you start to mimic each other's language. And it felt difficult to write a more removed essay about the piece when what I really wanted to do was inhabit it with those same kinds of raptures you spoke about in the poems, and to sort of mirror her language, to mimic it back, to try and further and more deeply understand a person who's writing I love. I don't know if I can say I love the woman because I didn't know her. But that was important to me when trying to enter the strangeness of the poet novel, was trying to write back to her and mirror back the strangeness of language in order to better understand what she was doing. I believe Leanne's next.
Hi, I'm going to read from my essay, and I want to thank Lainey for helping me edit it and smooth it. This is called Carnal Knowledge. Carla Harriman's Gardener of Stars, a novel. And it starts with a little haiku. A leonine brow pads summerly up to Carla knowledge. Early in my encounters with Carla Harriman's work, I wrote this strange haiku-like fragment around my desire to approach and understand her multi-generic writing practice, at once deeply cerebral and viscerally moving. I wondered why a poet would want to write a novel. What tools would become available in this way that would not normally be accessible? Could there be writing which accesses the strengths and permissions of poetry, at the same time making worlds unfold in forward momentum? The leonine brow is, of course, a pun on my name, as a feeling and thinking human animal reader who craves fulfillment of both body, carnal, and mind knowledge. That is the kind of work I want to approach. When people would criticize language-centered poetry as being disconnected from the body or sexuality, I would pull out the example of Carla Harriman's multi-genre book, Animal Instincts, to prove this generalization simply was not true. The very titles of her fractal-like books prove that critique wrong. Many of Harriman's titles contain 2 words which are opposites. This deliberate doubling aims high and low. Animal Instincts is both sharp and sweet. Her title, There Never Was a Rose Without a Thorn, is both earthy and celestial. Gardener of Stars manifests that walk along the edges of narrative and poesis, falling and roiling into the abysses of excess and pleasures of that dialectic throughout. The work is at once viscerally accessible.
Promethea pulled down her ripped in the crotch pants, opened his pants with her sweet hand, and sat on him with an indulgent calm until each suffered the greatest ecstasies of pleasure.
And syntactically visionary.
Girl, she screamed, as if she were screaming for the person who could no longer be.
I first encountered Harriman's work in the late 80s during the latter part of college. I was a member of a pack of young women writers hungry for new forms. We were curious about reading beyond what was assigned in our classes. We were hunting for linguistically innovative and radical poetry. We were studying semiotics, feminist theory and poetry, and in hot pursuit of examples of the poetry that would manifest some of the linguistic explorations suggested by French feminist theory. We sought writing and syntax that resembled our way of thinking. We were fascinated by Luce Irigaray theoretical writing, which spoke of the multiplicitous and nonlinear, and the fact that the theory embodied the very principles it sought to illustrate. What we didn't understand was why the theorists, such as Kristeva, only provided male exemplars, such as Joyce's Ulysses, and we were especially searching for women writers who practiced these experimental trajectories. As extracurricular research, we started reading the so-called language poets. We discovered Stein through their lens. We had not encountered any of this literature in coursework in English, American literature classes, creative writing, or women's studies courses. It was a utopian moment for me, one of the first times I united with others in search of knowledge that had not been provided to us in school. We found utopias and dystopias and heterotopias, such as Monique Vitigue's La Guerrière. This was the era of Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, Kathy Acker's massively multi-referential mashups, Monique Vitigue and her Island of Radical Text. La Guerrière uses a split non-monumental J/E instead of I. Je, eh. We read Angela Carter's Rewired Fairy Tales, Nicole Brassard's Mauve Desert. We read Juna Barnes' Nightwood with its lush tribadism. Is Gardener of Stars a cyber Nightwood after the end of the world as we know it? Is this how thinking in language could be if the novel is reinvented by a poet? Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower actually has poems at its heart, alternating with clear style narratives. But here in Gardeners of Stars, even the prose is intensely poetic.
Are the curses licking you on the breastplate, or the mind, since you are gone, left with sweet salt, without company, wandering? Is it me or you?
Harriman's practice traverses an ambitious landscape. She engages with and transforms a wide range of genres, melding poetry, prose, theory, essay, and experience-based writing. She does this as Stein does without sounding like Stein. Not only does her writing explode the limitations of genre, her work serves as a hinge between the almost opposite vectors of language-centered writing and strategies of new narrative, where frank language and explicit description combine to compel personal narrative forward. Harriman takes these permissions and runs with them. There are markers in her book that parallel her own experience, having a male child, for example, but totally transformed and wild. I recall and paraphrase from my notes a talk Jody Bellamy gave on Kathy Acker, in which she said that reading and thinking about Kathy Acker, it's always profound, the way she fucks rationality and always returns to the body, and that having to translate all this into a conventional essay is torturous. Harriman's work is in dialogue with Acker in its interest in radical transgressive collage, as well as the exploration and explosion of the novel form. Gardener of Stars functions in multiple genres. The novel is imagination in action. This impulse can be called utopian, even if not ideal. In reality, things change by disappearing and dissolving. In a novel, things change or happen over the course of the book, and you can always re-inhabit the world at any point in the story, but you are a different person then. Gardener of Stars defines the embodiment of the poet's novel. The book makes a world that the reader can drop into, be fully immersed in, that makes sense within itself. The book immediately plunges the reader into a shifting medley of connected landscapes and atmospheres that are highly unsettling in their mise-en-scène. If this book were a film, I imagine an alternately lush and barren Mad Max post-apocalyptic atmosphere conjured non-linearly with intercuts of poetic fragments, interrupting the more linear recognizable scenes. Poetic fragments function as reordered genetic code, Pantoum-like permutations splice through the narrative space as utopian architectures of dream. This flow, flowering, and reinvention of genre spans Harriman's career. The text is full of openings, a falling of clear exegesis and story that revolves to a chapter or section heading. That's your line.
I haven't seen a car since they were outlawed.
Associational, hallucinogenic, dreamlike, yet somehow very clear images and descriptions are of a reality never encountered or seen before. Here's an imagined utopia, palpable in its sensory detail. Then we turn the page and fall into a canyon of a poem which interrupts the landscape of the book, as no normative novel ever did before. Garden of Stars was published as the 10th book in a projected 50-volume project by Lynn Haginian and Travis Ortiz Atilos, whose mission is described as being devoted to publishing under the sign of poetry, writing that challenges the conventional definitions of poetry, since such definitions have tended to isolate poetry from intellectual life, arrest its development, and curtail its impact. Garden of Stars is presented under the sign of poetry, yet labeled a novel. This calls to mind other contemporaneous works such as Pamela, a novel by Pamela Liu, or Cian Nai's work, My Novel. The fact that these books are labeled novels implies that the writer wants them to be read through that lens, even though the works may not be immediately recognizable as fiction. One of the first clues I received about how to approach the book is in the dedication. A Garden of Stars, the dedication reads, "In Memoriam, Warren Sonbert." Having seen this master experimental filmmaker's streaming associational images, or rather images that stretch the bounds of free association, I knew to let the reading experience wash over and through me without having to understand each logical piece as it unfolded. Ron Silliman's essay, The New Sentence, is illuminating as to why much of this postmodern language poetry was in prose and used the sentence as the basic unit of composition. Stein's book, How to Write, with Stein's posit, a sentence is not emotional, a paragraph is, as well as her essays at once made clear, in-depth observation on the intimate relationship of poetry and grammar. An understanding of these innovations are essential to numerous manifestations of what is the poet's novel. So a lot of Garden of Stars engages in this clear style, sentence-based narrative mode, and then the disjunctive poetic mode, creating a dialogue between them. This alternating mode of poetry and prose is also present in Carly Harriman's collaborative book with Lynn Haginian, The Wide Road, which takes its name from Basho's The Narrow Road to the Deep Interior, and alternates prose diary entries with haikus and tankas that grow out of the specific context described. In thinking towards the definition of the poet's novel, I take Harriman's Garden of Stars to be a landmark exemplar of the possibilities of this form. This kind of sensory, mental, bodily integrated dystopian and utopian mode is at the heart of Carla's practice. It did take me a while to inhabit this world, but rereading it now is like opening a portal into a strange yet familiar, always surprising world. One of the most remarkable things about the work is that it's one of those books that after you live with it a little while, things from the book uncannily begin to appear. As the book unfolds, it powerfully illustrates the complex and sometimes abject situations that struggles for love and power can elicit.
Are you going to hold me to my words? Asked Gardner. I haven't decided yet, said M. Because I was talking about my thought, said Gardner, what you can see. If I could see your thoughts, said M, we would be having the same ones.
That's an excerpt. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to read a little bit from my essay on Philip Whalen's novels. And this excerpt is going to include a lot of words from one of the novels. Imaginary Speeches for a Brazen Head is the title of one of the novels, employs the device of a brazen head, called, in the case of the novel, the Grand Mahatma, or Mahatma, who appears now and then to comment metaphysically on the action. A brazen or brass head was a legendary machine in the shape of a man's head, usually owned by a medieval sage, that could answer any question, a kind of magical oracle. Friar Roger Bacon, who lived in the early 13th century in England, was said to possess one. The first speech of the Grand Mahatma appears on the novel's second page. The Grand Mahatma says, "She comes along and lights up each of our senses, then she selects a different partner and moves away. The numbers on our watch dial glow for a while after they've been exposed to the sunshine, then their light finally dies away. They remember for a while, then they rest. The circulation of the blood, the flow of the breath, what did I have for breakfast? Each of these trips a different brain electric relay network chain, brain clouds of light, the great Andromeda Nebula, other universes outside this one, which we usually think of as true and real, which we in fact keep insisting is the only one. Bright, billowing clouds that mix together into I want, I see, I remember, and more of the same sparkling fog produces the earth we're sitting on, produced Queen Victoria, Ashurbanipal, the cobalt bomb, all kinds of gods, Buddhas, unicorns, the fried egg sandwich we shall eat for lunch. Once again, like his other novel that I'm writing about, You Didn't Even Try. Those are the two novels he wrote. We have a large ensemble of brilliant and accomplished characters, all of whom are married to and or sleeping with one another in the webbing of, in this case, a fractured time frame that's designed to confuse the reader's sense of narrative flow. Roy Ahern, the celebrated poet who reads on college tours, drinks too much, takes too many drugs, sleeps with anyone who will have him, and eventually burns out and moves to Japan, just as Whalen did, is a central character, as is Dorothy, a linguist, maybe modeled on Joanne Kiger, who is married to Tom, a photographer, who sometimes takes porn pictures of young boys, but used to be married to Clifford, an organist and a scholar who mostly lives in Nepal and probably is modeled on Gary Snyder, and sleeps with Roy, who wanted to marry her, but ceded to Clifford's priority, just as Whalen was in love with Kiger before and after Snyder married her. Roy shoots up methadone with the artist and actress Margaret Gridley from Radcliffe, by way of a small town in Oregon. They stay up for 4 straight days, after which they drive to Reno and married, a condition in which they remain until one day Margaret runs into Herbert Wackernagel, her childhood sweetheart, and determines that she must now live with him. When her husband protests, she says, "Oh, Roy, come on." Earlier, or maybe later, Margaret marries Beefy Johnson, the African-American jazz musician. Other important characters include Max and Alice Langermeyer, he's a leading psychiatrist, and Beth and Mark Sanderson, he's a composer who is in possession of Flora McGreevy's all-important piano. Sarah, Clifford's English painter girlfriend, who was married to Max Gardner, and an even more famous painter, who left her in Europe to run off with his ex-wife. At any rate, the point seems clear enough. These are colorful, unconventional, actual people who are busily rushing around, living their lives like so many beams of light bouncing off one another, while the Grand Mahatma, like Nero fiddling in Rome, comments. The Grand Mahatma says, "We must practice doing everything right. We must practice being perfect. The saints, the bodhisattvas, the Confucian sages, all of them practiced at it until they could do everything perfectly. And they were perfect themselves, of course. Any one of us can do the same thing. What else is there to be done after all. Which reminds me of Thomas Merton, who first converted to Catholicism, and then having done that, decided that why would you do that if you weren't going to become a saint? And so then he became a monk and did become a kind of a saint. And the same thing with Philip. He did become a monastic and tried mightily to become a saint, although I don't think he was entirely successful at it. Going on with the essay. Brazen Head includes spectacular passages about food, psychedelic highs, and all kinds of mystical transports. There's an hilarious 3-page description of breakfasts in cafeterias, in the army, in his grandmother's hotel room, at Clifford's ancestral home in Idaho, on railway cars, on hiking trips, on elegant breakfasts served by Dorothy, as well as one of the most detailed and Baroque descriptions of a hashish high, Tom's high, that I've ever read. And this is a partial description of that from the novel. Dwarf slaves with huge golden trays of roast suckling pig passed among the throng. Others bore trays of swans and peacocks and pheasant, all served up in their own gorgeous feathers. Wine slopped over jeweled hands, naked bellies, gold fruit, veils, brocaded velvets, asses, tits, bellies, hands, shoulders, eyes, fantastic headdresses, mouths, big eyes above transparent jeweled veils, arms and legs glistening with sweat, oil, mouth, eyes. Tom swam joyfully out among them, his penis visiting here a pretty momentary cunt, there a pretty mouth, a pretty ass, a silent lake where he floated among lilies and lotuses, alone in silence of summer night. Then Dorothy was floating with him, quiet and understanding, everything resolved, all peace. Telephone! Paranoia doorbell! Where's Dorothy? Flying horse ladies above a ring of fire where she lies golden, asleep. And one final piece from the Mahatma. They ask me all the time, why is this world this way? Why is it all messed up? And I shock them with my answer. Somebody's making a pile of money out of it, that's why. Say, I need help. I hurt. Isn't anybody going to come help me? Isn't there any human being around here going to give me a hand? I hurt. Why don't you get me a doctor? Why don't you take me to the hospital? Why don't they give me a shot of something? Say, what kind of outfit is this anyway? I'm all in the dirt and on fire or something. Get me out of here. Caps, all caps. Just to say, this is a tremendous volume. And it's really big, and I haven't gotten through nearly as much of it as I want to. And the tremendous essays in here, and how did Lainey manage to put this together? And I don't know. And thanks to her and to Stephen and Nightboat Books, which is a terrific publisher. This is not the only great book from Nightboat Books. Thanks, everybody.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sonnet. I am coming to you from Snuneymuxw territory, which is Coast Salish Halkominum speaking Salmon people territory. So I want to say Haitchka, Siam, Cholmach Mistimach to the folks on whose territory I get to live and be. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Nurbese Phillips Looking for Livingstone. My plan is to read from the text and then read a bit from my essay, and if there's time, read a little bit more from the text. So Nurbese has been quite an influence on my own work too. In the beginning was nothing. could, would, be, without silence. Culture, nurturing the paradise, the parasite in word, with the upon of, hang, wait, depend. Word and silence feed the share in need, wed, content, content with the conspire in symbiosis. Embryo word, clasped, clings to the surround in silence. Divided by the fall in word into silence minus word, wanting silence, cleft, one into two, halved into twin, into split, severed by the Lord in word, whole, original. In the beginning was ravage, in word, inside time, inside history, silence, seeks the balance in revenge, the cut, imprecise, cleaves to the ever in word, seeking to silence, silence. So it may, I'm going to be looking off to one side here. It may seem somewhat of a false project to approach Nurbese Phillips looking for Livingstone as a novel, when the poet herself writes that the book was, quote, conceived as a poem in prose and poetry. It has narrative features, but it is a poem to my mind. Kate Eichhorn and Heather Milne, naming a genre in which they include Looking for Livingstone, define innovative poetry and poetics as writing that at the very least approaches language as an inherent problematic and a subject of inquiry rather than a mere vehicle for representation. So that definition fits Looking for Livingstone, which takes as one of its key epistemological concerns a mistrust of the word, particularly of the English words in which Philip must write. The simultaneous impossibility and necessity of articulating the experience of African diasporic identity in a colonizer's language, a problem which pushes the author towards syntactical rupture and open self-reflexiveness, is foregrounded in all of Philip's writing, except perhaps her young adult novel, Harriet's Daughter. But in strategy, Looking for Livingstone is closer to the groundbreaking poetry collection She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks, and to the also phenomenal Zong, with which you may be familiar, probably likely familiar, and may know that Nurbese is in this a struggle to have a translation destroyed right now, particularly because of the way the translation dealt with how she was representing silence. The problematization of language and disruption of lyric in Looking for Livingstone, and indeed in Philip's oeuvre broadly, arise less out of interests in Euro-American postmodernism's interrogation of the subject, or in language play that has its roots in modernist avant-gardes, and more out of the project of Afro-Caribbean writing to effectively represent Caribbean consciousnesses of the forces of creolization, subjugation to colonial people and practices, and sense of forced exile and displacement from their own language and history. Despite Philip's frequent association with language school poets, because of her insistence on the materiality of language and her willingness to look at language, quote, as an artist looks at paint, her drive in Looking for Livingstone is toward an affirmation of interiority, not a negation of it or of lyric subjectivity. Looking for Livingstone uses the strategies of innovative poetry to narrate her Black subject's successful quest to, quote, open a way to the interior or perish, and articulates through involutions of the traditional European colonial quest narrative her discovery of what Kevin Everard Quashie calls the sovereignty of quiet. Looking for Livingstone begins with a narrator setting out on a journey to discover something as yet unidentified. She begins her search before she knows exactly what she's searching for, but suspects that her compulsion to discover is related to the fervor that propelled the 19th century Scottish physician and missionary, Dr. David Livingstone, into the interior of Africa. Quote, "Where was I going? I had forgotten where I had come from, knew I had to go on. I will open a way to the interior or perish." These are Livingstone's own words. I took them as my own, my motto. He was shown the falls of Mosi-oa-Tunya, the smoke that thunders, by the indigenous African and discovered it, with quotes around it. Livingstone now lies buried at Westminster Abbey because he, quote, discovered and explored Africa. Perhaps he discovered something else, the same thing I search for. Okay. So this is a passage where the searcher, who's unnamed, talks to Livingstone. And he says to her, "You said you discovered silence. I don't understand how you can do that. Discover silence, I mean. It's not a thing like a river or a waterfall or a country." "Oh, Livingstone, I presume. How very, very stupid you are." He looked all crestfallen again. Come on, cheer up. Have another cognac." I held out the bottle. "It's damn good, isn't it? And don't take it to heart. You're one stubborn son of a bitch, and I respect you for it." His face brightened. "You know what they say about you." He shook his head. "That where there was a blank before you filled in, charted and mapped, and so I did, and so I did." His eagerness to claim his discoveries was both childlike and overwhelming. "No, Livingstone, I presume you did not. Shall I tell you what you did? You captured and seized the silence you found, possessed it like the true discoverer you were, dissected and analyzed it. You took their silence, the silence of the African, and replaced it with your own, the silence of the word." Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Cedar Saigo, and I just want to echo thanks to Nightboat and to Lainey and to all the poets I'm reading with tonight. I'm going to read just the end of my essay titled "The Doors of Perception in Eileen Myles' Inferno." And I wrote this quite a long time ago, and I just want to thank Lainey for asking me, because I learned quite a lot about my critical voice from trying something of this length about one of my heroes. So thank you. And my excerpt starts with a poem that Eileen included in Inferno, a poet's novel. And the title of that poem is "Shh." I don't think I can afford the time to not sit right down and write a poem about the heavy-lidded white rose I hold in my hand. I think of snow, a winter night in Boston. Drunken waitress stumbles on a bus that careens through Somerville, the end of the line where I was born. An old man shaking me, he could have been my dad. "You need a ride?" "Wait," he said. "This flower is so heavy in my hand." He drove me home in his old blue Dodge, a thermos next to me, cigarette packs on the dash. So quiet, like Boston is quiet, Boston in the snow. It's New York. Plates are clattering on St. Mark's Place. Should I call you? Can I go home now and work with this undelivered message in my fingertips? It's summer. I love you. I'm surrounded by snow. Eileen Myles once said to me that they had a lot of handles in their poems. I took that to mean places to make strategic crash landings every now and again. The traction of the poem is rewound when they stop to take a breath, like if Robert Creeley only hit his line break so hard a quarter of the time. In between, the voice feels thrown down concurrent flights of stairs. You need to hit the words correctly when reading aloud. The prose of Inferno works a little differently. There is more time allowed here than in the flashing tumult of Myles' poetry. You get all wrapped up in the narrative that Inferno offers, and they are forced to place themselves within the memories or to dredge up a few more details to hold us as a film does. The closing of Drops, which is a section in this book, deals with a reading trip to Hawaii and Eileen getting lost after starting off too late toward an active volcano. On their way back from the glorious view, they succumb to sheer exhaustion in the dark and sleep the night at the edge of a cliff. I found this section to be the most traditionally Dante inspired, as I had always imagined Dante and Virgil as action figures with the screen changing behind them as they muscle onward. Eileen in peril is absolutely fascinating, as in every previous instance of the book, they seem to always have an instantaneous cerebral response. There is something so endearing in their surrender to sleep here. Miles' Purgatory manages to hold the whole heart of the book in its hands. The funding of the poet who has survived under such conditions is really the least any foundation can do. This section of the book takes the form of a grant application. I should have mentioned that. Quote, I turned to the horizon, I headed that way. I saw a small house and those telltale signs of stones they call halau. Those little piles are holy. The house was the beginning of the road. There was my dark green rental car and my water, and I drove out of the park and I had to get some caffeine, lots of it, because I was falling asleep at the wheel. Everything was good after that, all three planes, and especially now, giving this account to you. Heaven feels different than hell, but the actual backdrop is somewhat similar. The final section of Inferno has less of the desperation and unknowing of the first. Eileen has met poets they can speak with about the process of writing, and they begin to perform their work. They also begin meeting women they want to sleep with badly enough to speak up. They are being given so much more attention. The rhythms of their life begin to fit effortlessly in sync with the rhythms of other poets, and a new constellation of community begins to move on its own. Community is heaven and the way in which it drives you. Eileen is still being led around to a degree, but within the marked path of poetry. It has become a practice that they can begin to believe in. These are fragments that sit and glow next to each other. They give off enough light to make us feel that these must have been joined at some point. It's important to play with that edge during a reading of your work. Quote, the walk to Roses was a flood of details, car coming towards me as I crossed Houston, put a cigarette between my lips, my lungs, this very good burn going down. I rub it, flooding my chest like a flower. Go into the bodega and pick up a couple beers. The possibility that I should keep living in this particular time in which I had been born, not bleeding into all the other times. Hear this footstep, not that. Feel that possibility and let it leak. Bump into a friend. Even if he was talking and talking, I can jump in and stop him. People were hearing me now, a little bit. I liked standing up in front of a room full of people, giving the torrent of words I chose. But each poem was a tiny torrent, a whole. Each person was a monad, a jot. Heaven is sleeping with Rose and the particulars of that experience. Heaven is also where people die. Miles remembers in 1990 the uncountable deaths in the circle of AIDS. They mentioned the great poet Tim Dlugos as one of the first to die, as well as a friend from Provincetown named Paul Johnson. They first hear of his death at the Whitney, watching a video by Nan Golden. Provincetown is a queer heaven that Eileen now feels equipped to actually enjoy. They love women and begin to hear in their poetry the possibility of transformation. Quote, it was the only way to produce the kind of glancing and wincing and exclaiming to depict a world of so many surfaces, wider than a book. The world's pouring would have to be a curve. The line would be running, cursive, infinity, a fight. The words needed to splinter off in some way just to describe it, so that any one poem could be a surge and nothing more, an intrepid break in time. Inferno would be an excellent book to hand to one's parent after years of their sneering at your unabashed involvement with poetry. We have a hero on our hands who has survived the depths of someone else's famous epic and is writing their best sentences yet. How do you turn such a machine off? How do you disappear from a party in which you have told a major piece of your life story? This book went by so quickly. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am really grateful to be here, and I want to reiterate the gratitude toward Lainey. I know that I wrote this in 2013, and it's been such a long journey, Lainey, and I just really admire how the book has grown and become itself over time. And I'm grateful to Nightboat as always. I am really delighted to be here with all of you and all the other readers. And I'm going to read a little. I wrote about Rilke's Notebooks of Malta Lords Brygge. My mom is German, which maybe is part of why I chose this. I also studied German in college. In 8 years now, I'm not sure why I chose this. So I'm going to read a little bit of the essay and then read a passage from the novel, kind of one of my favorites, and then end with a little bit. The essay that I wrote is called The School of Fears. Most critics and biographers agree in 1902 and 1903 in Paris, Rilke experienced a profound psychic crisis whose after effects would haunt him for the duration of the composition of Die Aufzeichnungen, which was about 6 years. Rilke's letters and Malta himself would agree that this crisis took one form: fear. I am afraid, Malta writes, one must take action against fear once one has come down with it. And though Malta indeed takes action by sitting up all night and writing, the remarkable fact is that this fear does not localize itself as a single phobia, but rather sinks the city entire in its shadow, endlessly proliferating. Fittingly, Die Aufzeichnungen contains, among other things, brilliant catalogs of terrors, and its most virtuosic passages are inspired by neurotic fright, paranoid fantasies, hypochondriacal conjecture, paranormal encounters, and nightmarish hallucinations. In a letter written in July of 1903, after his departure from Paris, Rilke describes to Andreas Salome his experience in language that will serve as a model for Malta's notebooks. I want to tell you, dear Lou, that Paris was the same sort of experience for me as military school, which was, he counted as the worst experience of his life. Just as then, a great fearful astonishment seized me, so that once again I was attacked by the terror of what, in some unspeakable confusion, is called life. And then I wanted to read you a good example of life attacking poor Malta in a pretty extraordinary passage that is still one of my favorites. He's in Paris, miserable, regularly hallucinating, and sort of in this Baudelarian funk, but without any style. I am lying in my bed 5 flights up, and my day, which nothing interrupts, is like a clock face without hands. As something that has been lost for a long time reappears one morning in its old place, safe and sound, almost newer than when it vanished, just as if someone had been taking care of it. So, here and there on my blanket, lost feelings out of my childhood lie and are like new. All the lost fears are here again. The fear that a small woolen thread sticking out of the hem of my blanket may be hard and sharp as a needle. The fear that this little button on my nightshirt may be bigger than my head, bigger and heavier. The fear that the breadcrumb which just dropped off my bed may turn into glass and shatter when it hits the floor. And the sickening worry that when it does, everything will be broken forever. The fear that the ragged edge of a letter, which was torn open, may be something forbidden, which no one ought to see, something indescribably precious, for which no place in the room is safe enough. The fear that if I fell asleep, I might swallow the piece of coal lying in front of the stove, which is maybe my favorite, because like, what the fuck? The fear that some number may begin to grow in my brain until there is no more room for it inside me. The fear that I may be lying on gray granite. The fear that I may start screaming and people will come running to my door and finally force it open. The fear that I might betray myself and tell everything I dread, and the fear that I might not be able to say anything because everything is unsayable. And the other fears, the fears. I prayed to rediscover my childhood, and it has come back. And I feel that it is just as difficult as it used to be, and that growing older has served no purpose at all. It's damn. So at the School of Fears, nothing seems to be what it seems, neither substance, scale, or causal logic. In the same way that a woolen thread may disguise a steel needle, so a shirt button might be bigger than one's head, and a falling breadcrumb cause an apocalypse. Rilke's skillful narration lets us know Malta knows his fears could be unfounded, but it also informs us that he is physically convinced of them, as incapable of shaking the sensations of terror as a child waking from a nightmare. Malta does not see holistically, which is like a super big understatement. Andreas Huyssen argues, rather he perceives fragments, and this bodily fragmentation causes his anxieties of excess, of flowing over, of unstable bodily boundaries. But if school is in session, in what manner are these anxieties pedagogical? Does Malta learn from his fears in the manner that Rilke learned from Rodin to see? Though Die Aufzeichnungen is in fact famous for Malta's hopeful declaration, I am learning to see, it is less famous for the more unsettling sentences that follow. I don't know why it is, this is Malta, but everything enters me more deeply and doesn't stop where once it used to. I have an interior that I never knew was there. Everything passes into it now. I don't know what happens there. Not unlike the shirt button that could be bigger and heavier than a child's head, or the breadcrumb that when dropped might destroy everything, the interior Malta discovers through the effort of learning to see disconcertingly escapes the usual measures of scale and causality. The interior is of unknown dimensions, and what happens there is likewise unknowable. As if that weren't alarming enough, Malta also can't help but take everything personally. His boundaries simultaneously expanded, everything enters him, and contracted, everything enters him. He experiences continual vertigo and synesthesia. I can't give up the habit of sleeping with the windows open, he writes. Electric trolleys speed clattering through my room. Cars drive over me. They drive straight into his interior, into the School of Fears, where something happens. What? Thank you so much.
So I'm just going to read the beginning of the first two, maybe three paragraphs of this essay. First two paragraphs are about the history of the serial novel. Sorry about the light. Let's see if I can shift this a little bit. Just to get away from that bright light. Quotidian and surreal, Nathaniel Mackey's narrative of musicology, musical performances, lectures, and dreams resists its narrativity by deploying rhetorical contradiction, paradox, and qualification, while valorizing musical vocal stutter, nausality, and hoarseness. Even the mode of the writing, fiction, criticism, philosophy, mythology, etc., resists generic identity and generic history, a poet writing a novel, a novelist writing a prose poem, for example. Since the earliest epistles, and Mackey's serial novel is primarily epistolary in form, first appeared as Song of the Annabulo 6 in part 3 of Song of the Annabulo 7 in Eroding Witness, Mackey's first book of poetry. However experimental they may be, the writings that dominate this first book are recognizable as poetry. Thus, one could justifiably read these two epistles as prose poetry or literary criticism. Still, given the fact that Mackey had not conceived the idea of the serial novel at this point in his career, that the book is largely comprised of poems, one would be on safe ground asserting that From a Broken Bottle, Traces of Perfume Still Emanate represents the work of a poet writing a serial novel. Because its matrix is wedged between poems in that first collection of poetry, the serial novel not yet conceived as such, only manifesting itself after several collections of poetry, represented a turning back to and repurposing or partial cannibalization of those early epistles in Eroding Witness. This arc or spiral describes the general trajectory of Mackey's novel in progress. Of course, the middle section of Eroding Witness also contained the first poems entitled Song of the Annabulo, although the themes that would emerge in other Annabulo poems and sections in subsequent books permeate the entirety of Eroding Witness. One of those dominant motifs is incessant, restless travel and movement. Thus, insofar as the Annabulo poems may be understood as a self-generating machine or algorithm, the serial poem meshes form and content. Because one could apply the same descriptions to the serial novel, it is clear that Mackey's writing projects have from the very beginning contested the very concept of genre, even as the writings manifest themselves in recognizable generic forms. Individually, the discrete poems and novels push against the constraints that invariably pull them back. Another and perhaps more pertinent way to visualize the dialectics of these writing projects is to imagine them in an elliptical orbit around their respective genres. As it happens, this bent circularity or elliptical circumnavigation appears in a number of illustrations throughout the serial novel. And by the way, I should also say that in this piece, I'm just writing about the first three novels. In what follows, I want to briefly focus on what I believe are just a few of the metonyms that imply a whole underpinning this work of fiction. As a whole, this object or idea is utopia, literally nowhere. But the question this novel, and I dare say the poems too, relentlessly pursue is whether or not nowhere has always been the case. Sorry, just lost my place there. That is, the serial novel worries over, sifts through what it imagines or hopes or believes are the remnants of a somewhere, a topia once extant or accessible. These remains, bits of glass, bottle caps, and cowrie shells, are thus analogous to or part of the balloons that appear in the novel, themselves analogous to or part of sphericity in general. Thus, I want to examine how the part-whole dialectics that constitute these metonyms manifest themselves thematically and formally throughout the entirety of the serial novel. Specifically, I argue that From a Broken Bottle, Traces of Perfume Still Emanate works against, even as it works for, the suturing of the spiritual and cultural, the personal and the social, the musical and the literary facets of these metonymic relations. In short, I argue that the serial novel calls into question the concepts of both the part and the whole, undermining the very conditions for the possibility of genre per se. At the same time, the novel is a delineation of its calling. It's being held by that which, however deconstructed, remains a potent center of gravity. However elliptical its orbit, the novel revolves around genre, a movement which, deliberate or not, mirrors the circularity of circumambulation, and thus it sanctifies in the last moment genre per se. So that's just the first 3 paragraphs of the piece. If you want to read the rest, I guess you have to buy the book. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm overwhelmed with just happiness of the moment, hearing these excerpts from everyone's work. That was just amazing. I think I'm ready to reread all the novels and all the essays. I really recommend that. It's a pretty ecstatic reading journey. At this time, we have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So I want to encourage anyone to put some questions into the chat for any of our readers tonight. And I am enjoying the appreciations that are coming in for all of our readers tonight. I do not see a question yet. If you posted one earlier, maybe repost it, but so there's a question from Denise Newman, who is another contributor to the anthology, who wrote an amazing piece about Inger Christensen's novel. One of, I'm blanking on the title, gosh. So her question is, where did you get the idea and nerve to make this book? Well, it's a little bit of an anecdote I'm happy to share, which is that, well, I'd been kind of obsessed with the form for years before I began thinking about this book. And I noticed that I kept being drawn to works, novels by poets, and that when I asked about them or I tried to research them, there really wasn't scholarship on them. And I was also trying to write novels myself. And I was just so curious for years. And then I was about to be moving across the country from Tucson, Arizona to here where I am and with my family, and my kids were young. And I thought, I'm going to be in the car for 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'm not going to really have time to be writing. This is the perfect moment to begin this book project, because what I really wanted was to be in conversation. I wanted to know what lots of other people thought, lots of brilliant people that I admired thought about the form. So I started out with a list of books that I was curious about. And sometimes I knew somebody had done scholarship on a book. Sometimes I just wanted to know what somebody would choose. And the conversation, as that conversation began, it grew. My reading list grew, the people I was in conversation with grew. And then once the book started to be happening, it became clear that it needed to be bigger. It started to take longer, and the conversation continued. So it was really the wish to be thinking with others and hearing what other people had to say about the form and broadening my reading and broadening the conversation. So that's was the beginning of the project for me. So thanks for asking, Denise. Leanne Brown's asking if anyone wants to say more about what makes something a poet's novel rather than simply a novel by a poet. So I want to throw that out to all of our contributors who are here tonight, those who read and those who are also here tonight who didn't read for this event. Hopefully there'll be more events. How do we do this? Do we raise hands? Let's see, Tyrone, and then Brian.
So you're not raising hand, you're calling out people.
Sorry, I don't know how I'm doing this. I saw you first and then Brian.
Oh, I think Brian had his hand up.
I'm out of
No, he said
order.
no, now I say no.
Okay.
I don't know, except, well, I had a teacher in college who said that you could always tell a poet's novel because it had very little plot. That was my a college teacher that said that. But beyond that, I don't know. I don't know. I have an answer for that question about a poet's novel rather than simply a novel by a poet. Although I suspect that the last part of that, simply a novel by a poet, is the beginning of a criticism, a negative criticism of a book that's been written by a poet. But beyond that, I don't know that I can make any distinction between the two.
I was gonna, I did raise my hand, but I wanted you to go first. I didn't want to, and I addressed this a little bit at the beginning of my essay, which is that I have a question about the relationship of the poet's novel to modernism. And that there's kind of like a really big flood of both important modernist novels, but also, Die Aufzeichnungen comes out in 1910. And to me, it's like it's a poet's novel at the very beginning of this kind of flood of the modernist novel. And so I just have that question, and it drew me to this passage from an essay by Virginia Woolf, which she wrote in 1919 at Modern Novels, where she says, she's describing Joyce's Portrait of the Artist. It attempts to come closer to life and to preserve more sincerely and exactly what interests and moves him by discarding most of the conventions which are commonly observed by the novelists. Let us record atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. Let us trace the pattern, however disconnected and incoherent in appearance, which each side or incident scores upon the consciousness, which I feel like let us record atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall feels like a definition of the poet's novel to me. But y'all can argue for many other things. Let us not take it for granted that life exists more in what is commonly thought big than in what is commonly thought small. The problem before the novelist at present, as we suppose it to have been in the past, is to contrive a means of being free to set down what he chooses. And so I really thought sort of the attempt to come closer to everyday life, the discarding of novelistic conventions, the emphasis on sensory aesthetic patterns within human consciousness, the reevaluation of what is deemed valuable and important, and the emphasis on creative freedom, like all of those things felt both true of the modernist novel, but also true of the poet's novel. And I realized I kind of couldn't take them apart or couldn't quite feel, this all feels true of Hilda Hills, shit feels true of Eileen Myles. So I don't know what y'all think, but I wanted to open that up because I was like, I have thought about this. I did write about it. But I'm curious what everyone else thinks.
Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you for reminding us of Virginia Woolf, and she has a lot of interesting things to say about the novel. I want to go to Sonnet and then Tracy.
Okay. Well, your question allows me to read just the paragraph that I skipped for time as I was reading, because it has Lainey's definition, or a quote from Lainey in it, that speaks to this question. And I also wanted to say, I didn't say how thrilled I am to be in this group of contributors, and thank you so much, Lainey, for all of your hard work and your wonderful editing. Okay, so it just makes me think about framing and how much the frame that we're given can inform how a reader approaches the novel. Saying that the back cover of Looking for Livingstone describes the book as an elegant and compelling novel, presenting her first as a novelist, then as a poet, which frames the experience as a story told poetically rather than as a poem with narrative features. I'm not convinced that a label makes much difference to the philosophical and historiographical work that this book or that other poets' novels might do. If we describe the poet's novel as Lainey Brown does, insisting that, quote, in a poet's novel, action is not more important than quiet, arc is not the same as plot, character is not necessarily person or portrait, and time is often a character or operative device, then Looking for Livingstone fits that bill. So just thought I would give Lainey's contribution to that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Tracy?
I mostly feel like I'm like, retweet what people just said. But my initial instinct at the question was to say it has to do with time and how time is being used, or how time functions in the text. But then I immediately also thought of Virginia Woolf and the waves. And I was like, well, you could say that about Woolf, right? Or Kew Gardens. I was like, which garden is it where the snail spends a really long time going through the story? But for me, my instinct was, and I love that what Sonnet just read about the idea of time almost as a character. So I think I don't have a definition for it, but I also think there's something for me about how time moves and is being used in more of that plot and scene way conventionally in a novel, and time is a little bit slippery and expansive, I think, in a poet's novel, where things just get mulled over and dwelt upon, and the lyric, right? The way the poem functions in a lyric is how time works similarly for me in a poet's novel. Although I think also poets write novels that feel very novelly, less poemy. And so I don't think it has a strict definition, but for me, my instinct at first was about like, oh, it's about, the answer is time, but I don't have a definition for it. But for me, there is some piece of that answer that lies in time.
Thank you so much. Cedar?
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say, in terms of Inferno by Eileen, as I mentioned, like the middle is a grant application to the Ferdinand Foundation. And then there are the obvious overlays with Dante and just straight up ripping out that pattern. And I also think with poets' novels, something, a variety of strategies at play, and not being scared of fragmentation and what that does to time, because we use that all the time as poets, and what gets left out in the poet's novel as opposed to what would be, part of the outline for the traditional prose writer. I guess that's what I would say.
Fantastic. Did I miss any raised hands? Any more raised hands? I just wanted to add about this question of time that's been brought out, that Alice Notley had something really smart to say, and I was just looking for it to quote it exactly, and I didn't find it, but it has to do with prose being society's enabler in linearity. So it moves you forward, whereas a poem sends you back into the poem, kind of this circularity. So we finished reading the poem and we're not done with the poem. Of course, that's true of some novels as well that are written not by poets, but it's pretty common in what I would call a poet's novel, if there's such a thing as a poet's novel. So I think it's time to wind up to, what do I want to say? I don't want to end this event. The conversation shall go on. There'll be more events. I hope to see you all in person. Please support Nightboat and get a copy of the anthology and all their other amazing lists. And yeah, just gratitude, so much gratitude for everybody who's here, everybody who's chatting, all the people who wrote great things that we didn't get to it, or, you know, we hear it, it's all here. Thank you for being here, and have a great night, and hope to see you all soon in 3 dimensions or more.
Yay, Lainey. Lainey,
Thank
Nightboat.
you so much, Lainey.
Yay.
Congratulations. Congratulations again.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Beautiful evening, beautiful event.
Thank you. Thanks all our contributors tonight who are here, those who presented and those who didn't, and those
Thank
who are
you.
watching this in the future.
Good
Good night.
night.
Night
Night.
all.
Night.